Ladies and gentlemen, this evening's Raymond Kalman Memorial Lecture, about which we'll hear more later on, will be delivered by Melanie Phillips, the noted broadcaster, journalist and commentator. The subject is the British left and the Jews. What went wrong? Melanie Phillips, journalist, author, commentator and broadcaster, I've said, was educated in London and at St Anne's College, Oxford. Always getting a special job there for Oxford, where she took a degree in English. She started on the political left, writing for The Guardian and The New Statesman, but moved to the right during the 1990s, and now writes a weekly column for The Times, covering political and social issues from what has been described as a social conservative perspective. A one-time columnist for The Observer and The Sunday Times, she defines herself as a liberal who has been mugged by reality. Melanie Phillips currently has a weekly radio show on Voice of Israel, is a regular panellist on BBC Radio 4's The Moral Maze, and frequently appears on BBC TV's signature shows Question Time and The Daily Politics. She also writes for the Daily Mail, the Jewish Chronicle and the Jerusalem Post. She and her husband, Joshua Rosenberg, the BBC's former legal affairs editor, have one child and one home in London, one child and one home in Jerusalem. Melanie Phillips was awarded the Orwell Prize for Journalism in 1996 and wrote All Must Have Prizes, an acclaimed study of Britain's educational and moral crisis, which aroused the fury of educationists and the delight and relief of parents. Her best-selling book, which we've all heard of, Lunganistan, attacking the British establishment's capitulation to Islamist aggression, was published in 2006 by Encounter Books, and 4 years later, The World Turned Upside Down, The Global Battle Over God, Truth and Power, with a foreword by David Mamet, was also published by Encounter. Guardian Angel, a memoir of her personal and political journey from being the darling of the left to the icon of the middle class, was published by M Books, which was part of her own business world, in 2013. She is known for her vehement criticism of Iran, the gay rights lobby, and liberal Jews who disagree with her opposition to a Palestinian state. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Melanie Phillips and invite her to speak about the British left and the Jews. What went wrong?
Thank you very much indeed for that very entertaining introduction. I'm always amazed to hear myself described in these ways. I always think, who is this Melanie Phillips? I better go listen to her. Good evening, everybody. It's really is a very great pleasure and privilege to be here and to see you all this evening. Thank you so much for turning out. And I'm particularly honoured to be giving this lecture in the memory of the late Raymond Kalman, who died almost a year ago. I only met him once at a Shabbat lunch given by my friends Judy and Matthew, Raymond's son, and I really really regret that I didn't have the chance to get to know him. As I understand it, he was quite a character. He was utterly devoted both to Britain and to Israel, but he was also one of the earliest British Jews to recognise and to publicly comment on the dangers being posed to Jews from the combination of the extreme left with Muslim extremists, as well as from the extreme right. Now, some 4 decades ago, this was a quite remarkable insight, showing extraordinary amount of prescience. Even today, people are bewildered and astonished by the kind of thing we saw last summer and have seen repeatedly on the streets of Britain and elsewhere in Europe. Left-wingers and liberals committed to issues such as gay rights, equality for women, freedom of speech, marching shoulder to shoulder with Muslims committed to the execution of gays, the stoning of women, and the suppression of speech. Now, what unites the British progressive with the Muslim theocrat, you may well wonder. But what does unite the British progressive with the Muslim theocrat who is stuck somewhere in the 7th century is, I'm afraid to say, their shared dislike or even hatred of the State of Israel. That hatred, which some may call bigotry, goes hand in hand, apparently, with being a Western progressive, because being anti-Israel or anti-Zionist is nothing whatsoever to do with being anti-Jew. And we know that because there are plenty of Jews who are anti-Israel or anti-Zionist, and they can't be anti-Jew, can they? So, people who think like that had a most frightful shock during last summer's Gaza war, when wholly unambiguous Jew stuff surfaced in Britain, with shouts on the streets of Hitler should have finished the job, the near barring of the Jewish Film Festival by the Tricycle Theatre on account of an Israel embassy donation of extremely modest means to that Jewish Film Festival, the trashing of supermarkets' kosher produce by mainly Muslim demonstrators who had worked out it was a jolly jape to go into Tesco or Sainsbury's, take all the chilled or frozen kosher food off the chiller and the freezing shelves, put them in trolleys, and as a result, all that produce had to be thrown away. Wonderful way of wrecking a business. Now, how could this be happening in Britain? Asked shocked British liberals. How indeed? Britain, where multiculturalism and anti-racism are now imprinted on its DNA. Britain, which by common consent has now moved very much to the left, a move which we should all endorse and celebrate, and so, as a result, is a kinder, gentler, and more tolerant society. Britain, which had legislated against hate speech, which is inclusive to a fault, and is, in my view, just about the most slavish exponent of human rights law in the world. And yet, what do we find now? We find some British Jews thinking that Britain doesn't really feel safe for them anymore, and they're worried about their children or their grandchildren being brought up in Britain. The Home Secretary, Theresa May, said very recently that she never thought she would ever hear it said that the Jews of Britain thought they might not have a future there. Now, I also thought that once upon a time. I also thought it was inconceivable that the Jews of Britain could ever think such a thing. I was brought up to be grateful to Britain as a country which had taken in my forebears and which I saw as the safest place in the world for Jews. Why? Because the British were grey, cool and damp, just like the weather. They were no threat to anybody. And it was also unthinkable for my family not to be broadly on the left, like many people whose ancestors, grandparents, great-grandparents came over at the turn of the last century from Russia and Poland. The family was on the left. They started out as, Bundists, and they ended up voting for the Labour Party. It was inconceivable for my parents ever to have voted Conservative. And for almost 2 decades, I worked for The Guardian, that great voice of Britain's intellectual left. Not that I ever really actually regarded myself as a left-winger. I thought of myself, as has been mentioned, as a liberal, as someone who simply believed in progress, in the betterment of society, and the capacity of human beings to create that better world. And I thought that the left and I, in Britain, were marching under the same banner. Well, in 1982, that belief of mine took a terrible shock. It was the first shock that it took, and it started to fracture around the issue of Israel. Now, it may seem strange to those of us who know what I write and say these days, but at that time, in 1982, I had never written or spoken about Israel. I had never been here. I never wanted to come here. I thought it sounded a most unpleasant kind of place. I supported it as a refuge for Jews who were being persecuted around the world, but Clearly, that had nothing to do with me. I was British, a diaspora Jew living in the most civilized country on earth, working for its most civilized newspaper, among some of the most civilized people you could find in the most civilized age ever known to mankind. How fortunate I was. However, around 1982, I became extremely concerned about what seemed to me to be an inexplicable vendetta at The Guardian and by progressive people in general against Israel. The Guardian had once upon a time, when it was called the Manchester Guardian, and was a very different kind of paper in those days, but when it was the Manchester Guardian, it had been a passionate supporter of Israel. Along with the rest of the left, however, the Guardian's attitude began to change in the 1970s, as the Palestinian leadership under Yasser Arafat, working in cahoots with the Soviet Union, which knew one or two things about propaganda and how to bend the mind of the world, rewrote history to transform the Israelis in the eyes of the left from socialist pioneers to colonialist aggressors, and to transform the Palestinians from genocidal aggressors into aboriginal victims. I, working for The Guardian as an editorial writer, began to notice that the paper's coverage of Israel seemed to me to be disproportionate, distorted, and quite viciously hostile, presenting Israel falsely as the bully in the region while ignoring or downplaying its victimization by the Arab world. It wasn't, it seemed to me, a question of whether it was right or wrong to criticize Israel, for example, in the war in Lebanon, which was indeed controversial. That was fine to have, your reservations, to oppose, to criticize Israel's policies, fine, but something else was happening. The coverage was entirely disproportionate and entirely one-sided, and I simply couldn't understand how this could be. The Guardian was known as a writer's paper. It believed in the power of words. It understood the power of language. It used language like an instrument. It was careful about what it wrote. It cared about things like accuracy. It cared about the truth. It scorned newspapers at the more popular end of the market, which did not care about the truth, which had an agenda, which did not try to be fair, which did not try to be balanced. And so I just couldn't understand what was going on. And so one day, in an editorial meeting with my fellow writers of editorials, I asked why there seemed to be a double standard at the paper. Why was there, I asked, only minimal coverage of Arab atrocities against other Arabs, while acres of space in the paper were devoted to attacking Israel? For what? For defending itself against attack, I asked in my naivety. And to say there was a sharp intake of breath in the room is an understatement. I knew instantly that something had changed, and that something had changed permanently. Of course there's a double standard, said my colleagues to me. How could there not be a double standard? The third world doesn't have the same belief system that we do in the West. They're not brought up to believe that there is something sacred or important about human life and that it has to be respected. They just don't understand this kind of thing, they said to me. We are therefore, they said, not entitled to judge any mass killings in the third world by our standards. We have to judge them by their standards. Otherwise, they said, if we were to judge them by our standards, that would be racism. However, they said, we regard Israel as part of the West. We do you that favor. This was the first time, in a moment, I became you. What happened to we? I became you. We regard Israel as part of the West, and so we judge its actions by our standards. Furthermore, they added for good measure, you Jews tell us that you are actually morally superior to the rest of us, so we're surely entitled to judge you by even higher standards. And I said, isn't that racism? If you're saying that if you're born into the third world, you're not entitled to the same expectations of life and liberty as the rest of us? And they said, why are you getting so upset? I was extremely shocked. This was pure racism. They were in effect saying precisely that citizens of a third world country were not entitled to the same assumptions of human rights, life and liberty as those of us in the developed world. And what they said about Jews was simply prejudiced and spiteful. I'd also been made to feel that I was suddenly regarded as no longer one of them, but something different, a Jew who was different, because I had questioned the double standard over Israel. And at the time, I was questioning it not because I was a Zionist. I had never been to Israel, never wanted to go to Israel. They knew that. But I was questioning it on the basis of fairness and truth and basic standards of journalism. And that was the reaction. And I was very shocked. How could this be? This was the Guardian, the shrine of anti-racism, the custodian of social conscience, the embodiment of virtue. Well, not long afterwards, I got the sucker punch. We were all utterly transfixed at the Guardian by the war to retake the Falkland Islands from the invading Argentines. You may remember this adventure by Mrs. Thatcher. It was regarded on the Guardian as a kind of Ruritanian nonsense. I mean, who cared about the stupid Falkland Islands? They were only full of sheep anyway. And so that was the debate at the Guardian. You know, was it the last sort of great imperialist, colonialist hurrah by Mrs. Thatcher, who, as we all know, was completely insane and awful, without any redeeming features whatsoever? Or was it something that maybe we should be concerned about? There are not really, we're British sheep. So this consumed us utterly. We talked about nothing else. Now, for a short while, that war in the Falklands overlapped with Israel's war in Lebanon. The Guardian's chief editorial writer was the very best kind of Englishman. He was very tweedy. You would think he would have stepped out of an Alan Bennett play. He was courteous, he was measured, he was thoughtful, he was fair, he was kind. You knew that he was just a nice man. A really nice man. So I met him one day as he pondered the affairs of the world. Well now, Melanie, he said to me that day in his courteous, measured and thoughtful way, what on earth are we going to say about your war? He was not referring, ladies and gentlemen, to the Falklands campaign. He was referring to the war in Lebanon. My war was now a foreign war. I'd suddenly become not really British, the outsider, the Jewish other, all because I had dared protest once at the injustice of the paper's coverage of Israel. Now, that was my first exposure to what I've heard over and over again since then, once indeed to my face on television. The charge that if a British Jew defends Israel, you're not truly British, and indeed you're guilty of dual loyalty. I once went to a meeting, a debate organised by The Economist newspaper, The Economist magazine, in which someone, I've forgotten who, some distinguished, nice Englishman, got up and said, British Jews got a problem. This was after the Second Intifada had broken out. It was, raging away. Israelis are being blown to kingdom come in pizza parlours and buses down the road. And this guy got up and said, British Jews got a problem. If they support Israel, they have to realise that there is a problem about them being British. And his opponent got up and said, did I hear you right? Did you really say that British Jews have dual loyalty if they support Israel? And this guy said, you're absolutely right. And the audience went, So I've heard that charge over and over again, but that meeting in 1982 also put me on notice for the first time that the left and I were not on the same side at all. The idea they were the embodiment of virtue took a terrible knock that day, in my mind. I mean, how could they not see they were making common cause with people who were everything they're supposed to be against? And I've thought about this over the years, subsequently, on many occasions. How could they be so impervious to factual evidence about the Middle East, about its history, about its present, about what the Arab world has done over so many decades, about what the Palestinians do and say? How could they be so bigoted towards Jews, now being openly accused by fashionable thinkers, writers, playwrights, actors, human rights activists, left-wing politicians, openly accused in the public prints of manipulating Western foreign policy for their own advantage, and even, bringing it up to recent years, of deliberately and inhumanly killing children? The left was supposed to be anti-fascist, weren't they? The left was supposed to be anti-bigotry, weren't they? They were supposed to be pro-reason and against conspiratorial rubbish, weren't they? Couldn't they hear the resonances of all this nonsense, of all this vicious demonization that was going on? Couldn't they hear the resonances with the anti-Jewish blood libels down through the centuries against Jews? Well now, the left are always utterly outraged at any suggestion they may harbour any prejudice against Jews as Jews. Israel is another matter, nothing to do with Jews. They make this absolute split. For the left, they cannot be prejudiced by definition. They cannot be prejudiced against anyone. They don't do prejudice because they are the acme of virtue. And specifically, opposing fascist anti-Semitism, Nazi anti-Semitism, is their moral high ground. Yet, at the same time, in recent years, in Britain, anti-Semitism has become the prejudice that dare not speak its name. If you're a British Jew, you utter the word anti-Semitism, and the result is, oh, there you go again, waving the shroud of the Holocaust. It's a kind of knee-jerk reaction. Any suggestion the animus against Israel is fundamentally, or even in part, even by some people, anti-Jew, provokes hysterical denunciation. The suggestion made not once but twice in the past few months by the former Labour Foreign Secretary Jack Straw that unlimited Jewish money controls American foreign policy in the Middle East, he said it twice, passed without comment. That's the kind of thing which in my childhood would have been said by a few crazed nutcases belonging to some neo-Nazi outfit, and it would never have been reported. And if it had been reported, it would have been regarded as absolutely beyond the pale. And now Jack Straw can say this and everybody goes, right, yes, you can see his point. The grotesque anti-Semitism that pours out of the Palestinian Authority and the wider Muslim world is never reported at all. And that's because in Britain, anti-Semitism is seen only as a historic crime and one confined to one set of people, right-wing people, otherwise known as fascists, because there is really no distinction drawn between the two. To the left, anti-Semitism can only occur on the far right, never in progressive circles, and certainly never in ethnic minority circles. This morning I was listening, as I do, to the BBC Today programme. It's my daily penance. I ground my teeth as I listened to its coverage of the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. It had gone to some trouble, it had produced lots of stuff on the Today programme, various items. I believe it produced other programmes. It was clearly very proud of itself that it was making a point about the liberation of Auschwitz. Jolly good! Jolly good. And I listened to them go on about, interviewing Holocaust survivors, and I listened to that tone of voice that the BBC does so well, sickening sanctimony, as they said, tell us about your experiences, and dear, oh dear, and how dreadful. And I chewed, if I had a carpet in my house here, I would have chewed it, but I didn't. Because the BBC has never reported, as far as I know, the lynching of the Jews of France over the past 2 decades or so. It has never reported the deranged Jew hatred in the Hamas Charter, or the anti-Semitism of the Palestinian Authority and how they incite Palestinian children to hate and to murder Jews. He never reports the ravings against Israel and the Jews by the Ayatollahs of Iran. On the contrary, it tells us that President Rouhani is a moderate. But whenever we Jews raise any of these things, we are apparently waving the shroud of the Holocaust to sanitize Israel's crimes. At the same time, some of the very worst Israel bashers dwell most reverently on the victims of the Shoah and boast, where appropriate, of their own record, if they're a certain age, in standing up against the neo-Nazis of Europe. I never forget on the, I won't say where, but I was in close contact with one of the founders of the boycott movement in Britain, and I heard him basically say there was nothing wrong in shooting settlers. There's nothing wrong in shooting settlers, that was justified, and this man would repeatedly say that he couldn't possibly be anti-Jew because A, he was a Jew, B, he'd been brought up by Zionists, and C, his father had marched against Mosley. That's why he couldn't be anti-Jew. So it's those people, in my view, who wrap themselves in the shroud of the Holocaust to camouflage their own vilification and double victimization of today's Israeli victims of anti-Jewish bigotry. In my view, anti-Israel attitudes undoubtedly serve as a cover for anti-Semitism, because the anti-Israel animus is not just criticism of Israel, it has the same unique characteristics of anti-Semitism, the tropes of medieval and Nazi anti-Jewish demonization, the demonization based on grotesque falsehoods about what's going on today in Israel, the hysterical imputation of a malevolent hidden force manipulating the world to its disadvantage, and the obsessive nature of that demonization. Today's Guardian editorial illustrates the left's vicious moral equivocations between dead Jews, living Israelis, and Muslim anti-Semites, claiming that the Holocaust is never entirely absent from our minds, and stating that it should never be allowed to happen again. It then takes a swipe at unnamed leaders of Israel who have been ready to exploit its vulnerability. Just think about that for a minute. Ready to exploit its vulnerability. How malign are these Israeli leaders in that case? And although it graciously concedes in this editorial that, quote, a people who came close to extinction cannot be blamed for not wanting to put their fate ever again in other hands, thank you so much, it equates the Jews of Europe who are gripped by a new insecurity with Muslims who feel the slow swell of hostility in the wake of jihadist outrages like the massacre at Charlie Hebdo. Such false moral equivalence obscures the threat to European Jews from European Muslims, and indeed omits to mention altogether the slaughter in the Paris grocery store after the slaughter at Charlie Hebdo. So absent-minded, these Guardian editorial writers. Now, why has all this happened? Why is it all happening? Well, much of it is because the British left has changed. In the past, it was famously said to owe more to Methodism than to Marx. That's because it believed, or the people who were on the British left, generally believed in something beyond the here and now. They believed that ultimate redemption would come in heaven. Politics was about improving the lot of man, but ultimate perfection was the province of the Almighty. And even those who weren't believers never presumed to do the Almighty's job for him. Since then, however, thanks to the weakness of the established church in Britain, secularism has broadly knocked religion for six. God has been replaced by man-made ideas or ideologies. Ideologies such as all the isms: materialism, utilitarianism, feminism, multiculturalism, environmentalism, many more isms, I'm sure. Now, what all these isms, what all these ideologies have in common is the Marxist aim of overturning the established order in the West. They have replaced faith in God by worship of the ideas of man, who will create the perfect society here on earth. Well, The left is rather chagrined to find the perfect society hasn't yet arrived, but it continues to try. But what these ideologies have done instead is to saw off the branch on which Western society has been sitting. And this is why. Because these ideologies are all basically utopian, they're in the business of moral perfection. And so their governing idea cannot be challenged. It's about perfecting the world in one way or another. So instead of using evidence to reach a conclusion, evidence is wrenched instead to fit the governing idea. And so, since independent thought becomes impossible, such ideologies are inimical to reason itself. It's hard to overstate the influence of these left-wing doctrines on our culture. They form the unchallengeable orthodoxy within academia. They are unchallengeable because they represent the desire for perfection. And so anyone who opposes them is basically evil. These are now the unchallengeable orthodoxy from in academia, from which they've managed to shift, in my view, the centre of political gravity in Britain, so that anyone who doesn't share these values is defined automatically as extreme, because the left believes that its particular secular, materialistic, individualistic and utilitarian values represent not a point of view, but virtue itself. The idea that some people may oppose the left because it's simply wrong cannot be entertained. The left can never be wrong because it's virtuous. No decent person can therefore oppose it. Anyone who does oppose it is therefore bad. They must also be right-wingers, who are always bad. And so, anyone who tells the truth is bad, and so the truth itself is damned as right-wing and bad, and so it cannot be the truth. That's how it works. Mad or what? But that's what we're living through. There can be no dissent or argument at all. Only one worldview is to be permitted. All other views are to be suppressed or destroyed. It's what the thinker J. Talman once called cultural totalitarianism. Now, one of the main weapons used against dissidents by totalitarian regimes is demonization. Those who challenge the party line are represented as diabolical. This is because totalitarianism is, as the name suggests, totalizing. It is the embodiment of not just what is correct, but of virtue itself. Anything that is censored is therefore evil. That's why climate change deniers, I'm sorry to tread on toes, that's why climate change skeptics are called Holocaust deniers. In similar fashion, those who supported the war in Iraq, or who now support action against Iran, were demonized as neoconservative warmongers who fashioned a sinister conspiracy to take America and Britain to war on a lie, all to further the interests of Israel. This was because a number of prominent neocons were Jews. The term neocon thus became a synonym for the Zionist Jewish conspiracy, supposedly a uniquely powerful and secret cabal which was said to have plotted for years to manipulate American foreign policy to serve Israel's purpose to the demerit of everybody else. Now, the key point to note about all this is that in Britain, this prejudice against Israel and the Jews is specific to the intelligentsia. It correlates overwhelmingly with education and social class. I always find, to my relief, when I come against the horny-handed sons of toil, the uneducated, the poor, the dispossessed, because I know they're going to be sensible and grounded and decent. The better educated the Brit, the more likely he or she is likely to be, and with their minds tightly closed. And the more likely they are likely to be anti-Israel and anti-Jew. This is because it's the educated classes who subscribe to ideas which purport to be the key to improving the world, but which bear no relation at all to reality. That's why intellectuals tend to be left-wing. And when the left replaced religion with secular ideologies, it was therefore the intelligentsia that fell for those. So Britain's educated classes are the most secular and the most anti-Jew. One of the principal drivers of academic Israel hatred was the Professor Edward Said, Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University until his death in 2003. His book, 1978, Orientalism, shaped not just academic Middle Eastern studies, but the humanities more generally for more than 3 decades. In this book, Said accused Western academics studying the Orient of perpetuating negative racial stereotypes and anti-Arab and anti-Islamic prejudice to construct an entirely false impression of Islam and its civilization. Zionism, he taught, was an imperialist conspiracy created for the purpose of holding Islam at bay. More than anyone else, Said made Israel hatred and the myth of Palestinian victimization academically mainstream and fashionable. His influence was enormous in promoting the cause of Palestine, demonizing Israel, and engendering a climate in which honest and truthful discussion of Islam became almost impossible, with one German Arabist, for example, observing that academics were now wearing a turban spiritually in their mind and practicing Islamic scholarship rather than scholarship about Islam. And it is, of course, university humanities graduates with their heads stuffed full of this rubbish and unable as a result to think straight about the Middle East, who've gone on to swing the intelligentsia as a whole behind this worldview, which has turned the universities and the media which the universities spawn into the crucible of unreason. And the media is stuffed full of these graduates, whose anti-Israel, pro-Third World groupthink has turned newspapers and broadcasting outlets into the propaganda arm of the jihad against Israel. But here's the thing, because this thinking has also driven the left into an unholy alliance with both neo-fascists and Islamo-fascists. This is what the left cannot bring itself ever to understand. And this is how this works. Neo-fascists and white supremacists generally express loathing for Islam and Muslims on the grounds that they just hate everyone who's not white. But a significant number of them make common cause with the Islamists. Why? Against the common enemy, Jews and America. And therefore, inescapably, they make common cause with the left as well. So some years ago, the British National Party advised its members to read The Guardian for information about the Zionist cabal around President Bush. Websites of groups such as the National Front, Combat 18, and the White Nationalist Party have reproduced articles by the left-wing journalist John Pilger and the Islamist group Hizbut Tahrir, and so on. But there's yet a further progressive member of this unholy alliance. Not just the left, per se, not just the Islamists, not just the neo-fascists, but the green environmental movement. Under the banner of anti-globalization backlash, ultra-leftists, neo-fascists, Greens and anarchists have united in a rainbow coalition whose common aim in smashing the established capitalist order is their only coherent characteristic. Anti-globalization protesters at G20 in March 2009, for example, smashed the windows of the Bank of England because they wanted to oust the bankers, abolish all borders, get rid of corrupt politicians and overhaul democracy, as well as protesting in favour of Palestine, carbon restrictions and action against climate change. The French Jewish leader Roger Cucurman dubbed this an anti-Jewish, quote, brown, green, red alliance among ultra-nationalists, Greens and communist fellow travellers. Get your head around that one. Now, these unholy alliances are based on more than opportunistic revolutionary opportunism to attack the West. The key point about all these movements is that each of them, however repellent you may find them, each of them is utopian. Each in their own way wants to bring about the perfect society, create a new man and a new world. Each therefore thinks of itself as progressive. The supporters of each believe themselves to be warriors in the most noble of causes. The Greens believe they'll save the planet. The left believe they'll create the brotherhood of man. The fascists believe they'll purge mankind of corruption. And the Islamists believe they will create the kingdom of God on earth. This notion, so beloved of the left, that the left and the right come from different planets, is false. They both have the same roots in the intellectual cross-currents that succeeded the 18th century Enlightenment. Both fascism and communism were movements hostile to reason. Just like communism, pre-1914 fascism expressed disgust for materialist capitalism. And if you want the very model of a left-wing Jew who incited hatred of the Jewish people, look no further than one Karl Marx, whose new man was to be created by renouncing Judaism from society altogether. This nexus between fascism and communism created in the 19th century led to fascistic ideas which were deemed to be progressive, a startling connection which continues to this day. 19th century social Darwinism, for example, led to eugenics, taken up with enthusiasm by both the Nazis and by European progressives. And the environmental movement, with its core aim to call a halt to dehumanizing modernity and return instead to an organic harmony with the natural world, was dear to the hearts of both fascist and Nazi thinkers alike. Hitler would have been a Green, or indeed a New Ager, devoted to paganism, esoteric mysticism, and organic vegetables. And this is also the connection to Islamism, whose founding ideologies drew freely on both communism and fascism. That's because, just like these two secular Western movements, which also led to fanaticism, terror and mass murder, communism and fascism, Islamism repudiates modernity and reason in the interest of creating a perfect world. So to bring my remarks to a conclusion and back to the overall theme of this talk, the trends I've been discussing, where ideology rules with an iron grip, now dominate progressive or left-wing thinking across the West. But it's Britain, the mothership of English-speaking culture, which is the brand leader of these ideas and the degradation of moral, intellectual and cultural life that has followed. Many examples of Britain's degradation I could give you, but briefly, whole communities there have become social and moral deserts where there are no committed fathers, relationships are transient and children's lives are devastated. British teenagers have some of the highest levels of antisocial behaviour and emotional problems in Europe. Educational standards, notwithstanding the heroism of Michael Gove, have collapsed. Obscenities are commonplace in public discourse. You go to a playground, you have 5-year-olds whose language I couldn't possibly relate to you this evening. Broadcasting, like the rest of the media, has become a race to the bottom. Why has all this happened? Britain's cultural demoralisation. During the past 6 decades, Britain has been systematically hollowing out its own culture through a loss of national identity and purpose, and the eclipse of an established church whose doctrines were built on sand. All this made it vulnerable to left-wing ideas that suggested the creation of a new Jerusalem, but which actually have, in my view, fragmented British society, eclipsed reason itself, and replaced truth by power, and has now all but paralysed it in the face of the threat from radical Islam. The truth is that what the left and the Islamists have in common is hostility to Judaism, Israel, and the Jewish people. The genocidal hatred of Israel and the Jews that drives the Islamic jihad against the West is not acknowledged by the West because its most high-minded citizens share at least some of that prejudice. This is how that works. Both Western liberals and Islamists believe in utopias to which the Jews are an obstacle. The state of Israel is an obstacle, both to the rule of Islam over the earth and the liberal goal of a world where there are no divisions based on religion or creed. The Jews are an obstacle to the unconstrained individualism of the Western sexual free-for-all and to the suppression of individual freedom by the Islamists. Both the liberal utopias of a world without prejudice, divisions or war and the Islamist utopia of a world without unbelievers are universalist ideologies. The people who are always in the way of universalizing utopias are the Jews. Who therefore could be surprised that post-national, post-religious, post-moral Britain is the home of the anti-Israel boycott, the hub of revived Christian theological anti-Semitism, and the principal money laundering for Hamas. In his novel The Counterlife, Philip Roth's hero remarks on England's peculiarly immoderate, un-English-like Israel loathing. As the novelist Howard Jacobson wrote 2 decades later, the peculiarly immoderate Israel loathing that Roth remarked upon in 1987 is now a deranged revulsion, intemperate and unconcealed, which nothing Israel itself has done could justify and explain, were it 10 times the barbaric apartheid state it figures as in the English imagination. After the Holocaust drove anti-Jewish sentiment underground, British Jews had a 50-year holiday from such derangement. Now, many are wondering if they've been living in a fool's paradise. There are many decent British people still in Britain, but they are disappearing and they are silent because they are frightened. People constantly ask, are Britain and Europe finished? Who knows? Will Britain and Europeans take back their culture? Will they fight to stop it being extinguished? Or will they just sit there and watch while it goes over the cliff? Who knows? And what is the culture that they need to take back? Is it the Europe that produced the Crusades, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and the Shoah? Or is it the European culture that produced Galileo, Leonardo, and the Enlightenment? What is the Britain that needs to be reclaimed? Is it the Britain that burned its Jews alive before throwing them out, and which shut the gates of Palestine against those trying to flee the Shoah? Or is it the Britain that invented liberty under the law, tolerance, and the rules of cricket? Raymond Kalman arrived, as I understand it, early in his life at the conclusion which took me more than 30 years to work out. He understood the totalitarian mind. He understood that when it comes to the abuse of power, there is little to choose between left and right. He understood that the defence of the Jews and the defence of civilization are one and the same thing. That is why I regret so very much that I never had a chance to talk to him, and why I am so very honoured to have given this evening's lecture in his memory. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think there is time for some questions. Anybody who wishes to ask a question of the lecturer, would they please stand up, identify themselves by name, and a microphone, a portable microphone, will be taken to them. Gentleman at the back. Hold on.
Do I need a microphone?
Yeah. This is rather a large space.
Melanie, thank you very much for a fantastic talk. You set out what the problem is, and horrifying it is indeed. So tell us, what do we do about it to return the world to sanity?
We'll take another couple of questions. Melanie will then answer them together. Name, please.
My name's Carolyn Freeman, and I'm a Jewish lady, and I...
Hold on.
Sorry. Thank you. Hello, is that okay? Hi, my name's Carolyn Freeman. I've been reading Melanie for years and years, and at the moment I'm living in Argentina, funny enough, and I'm making Aliyah to Israel. And interestingly enough, I was also not religious. I'm from northwest London. I just took for granted that being Jewish in London, I would be safe in London, in England, and anywhere else in the world. And frankly, until the last 5 years, I haven't really put up with anti-Semitic comments, heard anti-Israel comments. Now, in the last few years, it's become more and more apparent to me just how biased the news is. I've been reading Melanie and other readers. And one thing that really concerns me, even being here and meeting Jewish people, is, one thing you didn't mention so much this time, Melanie, is how a lot of Jewish people say, well, we're Jewish, but we don't necessarily support Israel. This I find absolutely incredible, simply because I feel that a lot of Jews out in other countries feel that they can have a comfortable life. Nobody's really hurting them, nobody's actually saying anything that's upsetting them.
Yeah.
But this Israel keeps getting in the way. You know, it's giving them a bad name and making their life difficult. And that's just an impression I picked up, and I'm very interested to hear what Melanie has to say.
We'll take one more question in this batch. Gentleman there.
Up there?
Melanie, thank you very much for your presentation, making me rather glad that I left England 70 years ago. I live here in Jerusalem for the last 53 years. My name is Shearer, Dr. Cyril Shearer, formerly of Britain when I was a child, after that New Zealand. I've watched this demonstration of distribution of propagandist ideas from the left and from the anti-Semites and the anti-Israeli Zionist movement in Britain. Great apprehension. It seems to me, I've always wondered how they could have got their act together in the last 30 years or so. We may disagree with their strategy, but I think you would agree that their tactics are perfect. They put all their guys in place 20 or 30 years ago in academia, universities, editorial boards with respect to public opinion. And I always wondered why, until you made the allusion tonight of Mr. Arafat presenting himself in Moscow about 1970, his funny little fur hat. I can't help wondering if somehow they haven't bought a propagandist, a strategist in propaganda of the highest order, just like the Iranians bought atomic secrets from the Pakistanis. What is your opinion? The question is it possible that they have some central propagandist school in Eastern Europe who's taking care and possibly still taking care of the propaganda movement in Britain today?
Well, I'm grateful for the first question for inviting me to go in for the Nobel Peace Prize. I haven't the faintest idea how you return the world to sanity. I do know that we are not using the right strategy. By we, I mean we Jews, both in Israel and in the diaspora, because there is no strategy. It's chaotic, it's incoherent, it's firefighting. And there is no strategic understanding that what we as Jews have been subjected to is psychological warfare on what I would call the battlefield of the mind, which, as a subsequent questioner suggested, has been invested in with an enormous amount of money and manpower over more than 5 decades. And we have been just, leaving that space open for colonization. And so if we are to have any hope of turning our own situation around, by our own I mean in defense of Israel, there has to be a strategy to deal with this, a strategy for combating psychological warfare, a strategy which understands how you appeal to different audiences, a strategy which delegitimizes the delegitimizers, a strategy which understands the enemy that we're facing. I mean, the Israelis have absolutely not a clue who they're dealing with. They make no effort to understand the Western mind. Therefore, they fail to understand that the Western enemy has an Achilles heel, because the Western progressive is interested in one thing, his or her own image to him or herself. And with that Achilles heel of narcissism, you can actually get at them quite easily through ridicule, through using at them the kind of weapons they use at others. So there's a lot of tactics that one could use that one is not using, and I also think that the Jewish world should be speaking truths more clearly. That the Jewish world has gone along with these big lies, that it's all about, 2 states. If only there was a Palestine state, there'd be peace tomorrow. The Jewish world doesn't talk about Muslim anti-Semitism. It started to recently, but not enough, and so on and so forth. But basically, that's the Jewish world not doing its job properly in presenting its own case. How you return the rest of the world to sanity is obviously a much bigger question. The answer to my question is the question that I finished up with. Whether the West, whether Europe and the West, really are going to say collectively, you know what, it was nice while it lasted. Age of reason, great. Science, fantastic. Freedom, wonderful. Democracy, yeah, I liked it a lot. But it's over now, so that's it. They're going to say that? I don't know. Maybe they are. Maybe they're going to say the cost's too high to do anything else. We're just going to kind of sit quietly and hope no one notices us, and hope no one arrests anybody, and hope that our children don't get murdered in the street, and we'll muddle through. They're going to do that? Maybe. But they're going to fight. I don't know. I don't know. But so, these things are unanswerable. But what I do think is that we will just have to keep on keeping on and speaking up as much as we can, and speaking in a more sensible fashion. Lady, you asked about Jews not supporting Israel because they're very comfortable in their own lives. That's absolutely right, and that is a particularly British phenomenon, I believe. I don't think people in France, Jews in France, feel quite so comfortable with their own lives at all, for obvious reasons. And in Britain, it is still perfectly possible to be a Jew in Britain and not to find anything untoward about your life at all. You live in a nice Jewish area, your children go to Jewish schools, your friends are all drawn from the same Jewish circle, you take a civilized line like the Northern Line to work in Oxford Circus, you come back on the Northern Line, there's the occasional person wearing a kippah, you feel quite comfortable about that, because there's somebody else wearing kippah like you. It's fine. You don't listen to the BBC very much in terms of, you don't tune in to the BBC Today programme because you're not interested in Israel. Why should you be? You're quite comfortable. Nothing's troubling you. So, the BBC going on about Israel, who cares? They go on about everything. They go on about everything. So, those people are fine. Those people are fine. And maybe they'll continue to be fine. And maybe they won't. Maybe they won't. So, personally, I felt, the place was psychically unsafe some years ago. I felt, if I'm being made to feel uncomfortable being a Jew in Britain, and I'm being made to choose, then I can't, this is unsustainable. And that's why many Jews don't feel like that. And you can't make them. I do think that the events of the last few months have shaken a lot of people very badly. And I'm afraid to say that I think there are going to be more events like that, and they're going to continue to be shaken. But whether the Jews of Britain will be shaken in the way that the Jews of France will be shaken depends very much on the level of physical violence that they encounter. I don't think anything else will really shake them. And as for Muslim tactics, I take the gentleman's general point, but I haven't got the faintest idea whether there's a central propagandist in Eastern Europe still pulling the strings, but he doesn't need to, because the job is done for him.
Any more questions? We'll take 2 or 3 more. 2 or 3 more.
Here, look up.
Gentlemen down here.
My name is AviChai, and I'm Raymond Calvin's brother. And my wife and I have just made Aliyah from Belgium. And our children are very nervous. Raymond's nephew and niece don't know where to go. I've got a question. It won't be very long. Listening to you, amongst the many things you said, I got the impression that you seem to be insinuating, not insinuating, it's the wrong word, suggesting that without religion, society was failing. Is this your understanding? Are you saying we need religion in order to keep our society together?
Another question now?
Hello. I'm here. Look up. I'm here.
You don't need a microphone.
Don't worry, we can be out.
Thank you very much. We cannot continue with all of this stuff.
Aaron Bronstein. Thank you very, I'm originally from Brooklyn. I love Israel so much I made Aliyah twice. The last time was 18 years ago. But to the question, I think we have in our own genes, after 2,000 years of powerlessness, part of the problem and part of the solution. And I'd like your comment on that. We become so obsessed with changing the world, improving our own society, as if improving our own society is going to stop the tsunamis and the earthquakes and the fascism that is swirling around us. And there are just too many Jews, too many Israelis that have moved back into their shell, not realizing that now there is responsible Jewish sovereignty and that we have an opportunity to be a herald at the gate. And we shy away from it because we still, after only 70 years, don't think we're up to it. Thank you.
Question up here.
My name is Jay Shapiro. Considering the fact that a nuclear armed Iran is a danger to the Western world, physically even, would it be fair to ask you to comment in this forum on the controversy about Bibi's going to Washington to speak to Congress?
Greer.
I'd like to know. My name is Greer Cashman. I'd like to know, are you grateful to the left for making you a Zionist?
Gentleman asks whether I'm insinuating, great word insinuating, I love it, that religion, without religion society is failing. No, I'm not insinuating, I'm saying it. For these reasons, and not just any religion, for these reasons, first of all, the West Europe is particularly vulnerable to Islamist aggression because the Islamists understood what the West doesn't understand still, that without religion you don't fight for what you believe in. And what the West will not accept, because now we don't do God, only people who are barking mad or incredibly stupid do God, as we all know, and the West are very clever. And so what the West doesn't choose to realise is that all the things they believe in, like freedom and democracy and human rights and all that kind of stuff, you know, basically the equality of us all, you know, we're all equal to each other, we all have a respect for everyone's life. Amazingly, that didn't spring fully formed from the human brain, from nothing. It came from the Hebrew Bible. And a society that's destroying its core religion, which lies at the basis of Western civilization. And don't talk to me about Greece, I know about Greece. But without the Hebrew Bible, without the Mosaic Code, you would not have the West. And that's the branch they're sawing off in the West. And so yes, I do believe that without religion we're not going to win this, and I do believe that without the Jewish religion we're not going to win this. And I believe that unless and until Christianity recovers itself and reconnects itself to its Jewish roots, we're not going to win this. Iran, Bibi, DC, I don't know what's in Prime Minister Netanyahu's mind. Like, Jewish people will stop calling him Bibi, it's very disrespectful. I don't know what's in his mind. I don't believe he's gone to DC, he's going to DC to speak to Congress in order to win the Israeli election. I think he's going to DC because he's desperate, because he is, I don't know what he's party to, I don't know what information he's party to, but I get the general drift. That, you know, we're at the 11th hour and 59th second, and he is desperate to stop Obama from giving Iran the bomb. So I am prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt, call me naive, but I'm ready to give him the benefit of the doubt. I don't believe that he is so cynical that he would just go to DC to win the Israeli election. I mean, what's happening? It's turning people against him. I mean, how stupid is that, if that's what he was doing? Am I grateful to the left for making me a Zionist? As I say to my former colleagues at The Guardian, you made me what I am today.
Okay, we'll take another 2 or 3 questions. Hold on. Okay. Near the back. There are 2 near the back.
Look up. Oh, very good.
We'll get to you, sir, we'll get to you. You have to understand, we are almost blinded here by the light.
Yeah, up here.
Okay.
Hello.
I
wanted to ask a question. My name is Charles Sellinger from the United States. I'm here on a sabbatical year in Jerusalem. My question is, Melanie, Phillips spoke about events in the West and tendencies in the West. But you didn't speak about the situation in Israel, in the intelligentsia in Israel, where you have very much the same medley of events. The Greens, the environmentalists, the left. So I don't think the issue you speak about Europe is not related to Israel. The same situation exists here. and you spoke about the secularization of society that is happening in spades in Israel as well. Can you move it from your comments on the European situation to the contemporary Israeli situation?
We weren't talking about Britain, incidentally. Gentleman at the top.
Since you've dealt with England so perfectly, Melanie, the question is the same thing happening in the United States, only slower, or is there something else going on?
Another question. We've been relatively lucky, I think, with the prime ministers in England for the last few decades, and why do they seem to see what the rest of the people don't see? And can you comment about the royal family not visiting Israel or...
I'm sorry, you've lost me in your pronouns. Who doesn't see what?
It seems that Cameron and all that, their statements and their predecessors seem to be more even-handed than The Guardian, for example, and it seems to be like that. And it's not quite so with the royal family, I would say.
The Israeli intelligentsia, the same medley of events is happening here as is happening in Europe. That is correct. I know you're right. I read what some of the people in Israeli universities are saying, and it is quite beyond belief. It really needs a psychiatrist up here, frankly, rather than me. And I also think that it is doing terrible damage because it feeds into the left. It feeds into the discourse in Britain and Europe. I mean, The Guardian, The Guardian just wouldn't know what to do with itself. It didn't have Haaretz to feed its point. I don't know very much about the internal Israeli social scene, but what I see with the Israeli education system, I just can't believe it that these are Jews who are so careless of education and who don't educate their children in any recognizable sense, apart from some pockets which do. I'm always astonished. I go sometimes meet professors of this or that at Israeli universities, and the talk turns to Britain, as it often does. And I will mention Britain's history in Palestine, and I can see they concede it, but I can see they haven't got the faintest idea what I'm talking about. But then history started in 1948, and I find this absolutely astonishing. So it does need absolute attention, but Israel is different from Britain in this sense, and this relates to the second question, which was whether the same thing is happening in the United States. Because the same thing is happening in the United States, and it's happening in Israel, it's happening in the West, but these countries respond differently because they have different, what I would call defensive or protective mechanisms. The point about Britain is it has no defensive mechanism. Its ruling elite basically gave up, lost an empire, never found a role, you've heard that one before. But the church is absolutely crucial. The church should be a bulwark, and it just collapsed for all kinds of reasons. If you look at America, the Cultural War has been raging there for several decades. And it's been largely held off by the solid kind of red state Christian right, as it's often called, sort of evangelical believers who give American Jews heart failure because they believe that, come the end of days, these Christians believe that the Jews will all be converted, and they say to me, how can you possibly support these Christians? Because at the end of days they're going to convert us, and therefore they're all anti-Semites, and it's going to be terrible. And I say, well, I'll take my chance on that at the end of days. For the moment, they are the people who are responsible for America's support for Israel. Are you mad? So we have that kind of conversation. So the Christians of America are the bulwark, and they're a bulwark in the culture war. Now, it depends who you speak to. I speak to people who are very pessimistic in America, scholars who followed the culture wars for a long time, and they say the thing is being lost. That secularism is making inroads. It's making inroads, as it were, from the coasts inwards. It's making inroads through the intelligentsia. It's being held at bay by the kind of red state type people, but it's fraying, and it's fraying rather badly. In Israel, I think there's a similar bulwark. I don't wish to give this gentleman who was the insinuating gentleman more heart failure, but I think that, I draw great comfort from the increase in modern Orthodox, in Dati Leumi, who I think are the bravest of the brave when their children go into the army. And they are the people who are completely solid and know what they're fighting for and know what this country is about. And that's what you need. You need that bulwark. Now, whether they are enough to combat the insanity of the left in the universities, whether the American Christians are enough to combat all that, it remains to be seen. But at least there is a bulwark, whereas in Britain there isn't. Last question. Mr. Cameron is more even-handed than predecessors, and somehow the royal family is involved in this. Okay. Right. Well, Mr. Cameron started as Prime Minister knowing nothing and caring less about abroad. He knew absolutely zero. Does he cared less because abroad wasn't going to vote for him. Now, something has happened to him in the last, I would say, last year or two. Someone has been talking to him rather urgently about what might happen at home to British people who might be murdered in large numbers. And he's made a few connections in his brain. And he's understood that actually, Israel's probably quite important. But he doesn't really like to say that too loudly, because it's not just the left, but his wretched Conservative Party can't stand Jews either, with a few notable exceptions. So he's a bit quiet, but he's not bad. He's shaping up not badly, although if you kind of look at the trajectory of, threats to the West through violence and nuclear war, it's going like that, and he's kind of, so a little bit more speed wouldn't be a bad thing, but it's sort of going in the right direction, to something, unlike other people across the Atlantic who should not be mentioned. Now, the royal family. I know everyone gets very excited about the royal family, and everyone gets very excited about the fact that Prince Charles and the Queen and all the rest haven't been to Israel. Isn't this just proof that they are all anti-Semites because they're German?
Yes.
No. The royal family does nothing that is not ordained by the British government in the Foreign Office. The royal family is a constitutional monarchy. It does not choose to go to places like Saudi Arabia. It goes there because the British government says, you go there, we need it, we need their billions, or whatever it is. That's why they go. And the British government does not think it is expedient for the royal family to bestow the mark of approval upon Israel, because too many British interests will be lost, in their view, in the Arab world. That is why the royal family hasn't come here. I'm sure if it wasn't for the Foreign Office, I'm sure Prince Charles will be sunning himself on the beach of Hetzley like the rest of you.
Charles was here for the Queen's funeral, but that was just one of
He says that if you're game, she is game for another couple of questions. Lady there. Name please. Wait for the microphone.
I really would like your opinion about the Church of England, the Roman Catholic Church, the church hierarchy in general, which has not spoken about Muslim theology and the denial of the temple where Jesus preached against. Why has there been no statement against this Muslim theology which goes against basic Christianity and its beliefs? There are many Christians who will speak out if the church hierarchy does.
Gentleman over there.
Good evening, Melanie, and thank you for a wonderful talk this evening. My name is Robbie Abrams, ex-South Africa. Short and sweet and to the point, what is your attitude towards Sharia law and the enshrinement in many European countries, and as far as I know, the UK as well?
Very wise.
One.
I have this question. I'm talking. Melanie, you opened up a door when you made a comment about British financing of Hamas. And there's a saying, let's follow the money. In addition to giving us some idea of what kind of money comes from Iran, Qatar, Turkey, and other oil-rich Arab countries, isn't the exposure of the corruption and terrible use of the money for barbaric purposes a key to waking up these progressives? Please elaborate on that.
Gentlemen at the back, and with that, I think we will call it a day.
Shall I wait for a microphone or can I speak? My name is Martin Kelson. As a Canadian, I want to give a shout out to our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper. Who, from my point of view and the view of many, as a true conviction politician, not just with respect to domestic matters in Canada, but certainly with respect to international affairs, and in particular, the situation of Israel in the world today, and questions related to anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, is a true force for the type of values I think that this audience and Melanie represent. The question I have is why there is not more attention paid in the media outside of Canada, and to a certain extent in Israel, to leaders of countries such as Canada and Australia, which are not insignificant countries in the world today, and the conviction that drives these leaders in support of Israel and in support of democracy and freedom and all the types of things that we show ourselves to be in favor of tonight.
I think one reason might be that they don't have a journalist like Greer for attachment of Australia.
My name is Kenneth Rudell, and I'd like your comment, please. After the French massacres, we have rabbis in France saying Jews should not leave France, and we have leftist Jews saying Jews should not come to Israel. Very confounding and very disturbing. So I appreciate your comment.
Elkin Levy, what's going to happen in Britain after the election on the 7th of May with regard to Israel?
We're taking no more questions. I'm sorry. This is the Speaker's desire. She has answered many questions and all had an opportunity.
Right. Okay, what interesting questions. Thank you so much. The Church of England and Roman Catholics in Britain have not spoken about Muslim theology, and this is, how can this possibly be? It's stranger than that. The Church of England and the churches generally have not spoken about the persecution of Christians worldwide. I mean, the Christians are being effectively wiped out in Africa. Well, they're being persecuted in Africa, They're being burned alive in their churches. They're being effectively wiped out, as I read, in Mesopotamia, in the cradle of Christianity. And the churches are silent. And this goes hand in hand with the second terrible thing, which is not only they're not spoken out against Muslim theology, but they have, as far as the Church of England is concerned, they've extended the hand of friendship to Islam. They're very big on interfaith in the Church of England, and they signed accords with the Muslim world on the basis, as I understand it, that if you reach out to people and you're nice to them and you say, we understand your pain and all that sort of stuff, they'll stop killing you. This is a terrible thing, that the Church of England has never spoken out properly against what's going on, and in my view, if they did, far from making the situation worse with their flock, it would hardly be worse, they would be improving matters considerably, not just for Christians, but for the whole of the defence of the West, because the Islamists understand one thing, they understand strength and weakness, and if you are silent, they take it as weakness, and they take it as an incentive, a major incentive, to up the stakes in terms of the murder industry they're in. There is only one thing that will deter them, and that is strength. I don't just mean physical strength, I mean psychological, emotional, intellectual, civilizational strength. What do I think about Sharia law? I'm not terribly keen on Sharia law. I'm sorry that causes offence. I do try to be inclusive. The British have kowtowed to Sharia law with disastrous effect. They seem to think, because they can't understand religion, because they think basically anyone who is religious is basically a Muslim anyway, they think, well, you know, Muslims have strange customs and we're not too keen on the cutting off of hands stuff. But the rest of it, I mean, it's a bit like the Jews, isn't it? They have funny clothes, they have funny food, they do strange things to private parts of small children. I mean, it's their thing, isn't it? So, you know, the Jews have got their own religious courts, so what's wrong with Sharia courts? That's how it goes. And then you've had, in the last few years, you've had the former Archbishop of Canterbury and the former Lord Chief Justice getting up and saying, we embrace Sharia law, nothing wrong with it. It's just like the Jews. And what they don't understand is that unlike the Jews, Sharia law is based on the belief that there can be no secular authority to which it is answerable, that the only authority is that of God, therefore there can be no secular government. And so Sharia courts and Sharia law are in the business of basically subverting one of the core precepts of the West, which is one law for all. And you know, Jews in diaspora always held the law of the land is the law. And you know, the Beit Din do their thing, but they're basically informal tribunals because they're under the law of the land. And that's the great difference. And by saying, well, you know, we're not going to go into the sort of Sharia law stuff, we don't mind it, it's not true, quite true, as the questioner said, that it's been enshrined in England's laws. Not at all, but it's tolerated, it's not opposed, and consequently you have Sharia enclaves, Muslim enclaves, where Sharia law is the local law, because that's how it is in practice, and with terrible consequences, particularly for women, who notionally are under the law of the land, but actually are too frightened to come forward and seek the protection of the law of the land, and they are actually governed by Sharia law. So it's a more complex situation, but the government has kind of ignored it. And this brings me on to the next question about UK financing the Hamas, because Sharia finance is part of this. I remember when Gordon Brown announced triumphantly that he wished to make London the global centre of Islamic finance, and everybody went, oh, pound sterling signs into infinity. And I went to meetings of finance houses and they would say, so these are all the things we put in train to do this and that, and this is zakat, which is the charity, they do all the lingo, and I would say, you do realise that on the Sharia boards of your finance house and the other finance houses, there are people who are engaged in money laundering for Hamas, and they went, what? And that's what happens, that's what happens. And so London, you know, Britain's economy is dependent so much on London being this tremendous financial hub. They are desperate for the money. And so the gentleman asks whether the exposure of the terrible things that Hamas have been doing with the money will stop, will wake up Western leaders. I'm afraid, you know, it's going to have to be a lot worse, more locally, before they'll do that. Having said that, the government has changed its position. Under Mr. Cameron's government, all credit to him, the Charity Commission in London, which regulates charities, has begun to be tougher about these charities. There is now a perception in government that we've got to crack down on these charities. And I think it's also helped by pressure from Saudi Arabia, which is saying, excuse me, Britain, but you know, do you think we could possibly stop funding and helping fund and helping promote the Muslim Brotherhood? It would be so nice if you could tell us what's the matter. But on the other hand, Britain is also sucking up to Qatar, which is the main funder and promoter of the Muslim Brotherhood. And Qatar has invested, what is it, £20 billion sterling in Britain so far. And so there are all these pressures. Basically, follow the money, as somebody said, and I'm afraid the money leads you to not a very nice place. Stephen Harper, absolute hero. My only wish is that he could emigrate and become the next United States president. French massacres, should the Jews leave, should the Jews stay? I didn't quite understand that question, not for me to tell the Jews what to do. Jews of France, I think they're perfectly capable of working out their situation for themselves. And the question that we haven't allowed in this session, what will happen to Britain after the election? We could have the absolute nightmare, in my view, which is a government headed by Ed Miliband, a person who is reviled, hated, loathed and scorned by 99.9% of the population, who wins by default and props up a minority government with the help of the Scottish National Party. And if you think Britain has had problems in the past in relation to its attitude to Jews in Israel, you ain't seen nothing yet.
Thank you very much. We will have a vote of thanks in a moment. But first of all, I have a few announcements to make. Those of you who are not familiar with the Jewish Historical Society of England's Israel branch may not know that we do this at the end of lectures. Our next meeting on Wednesday, the 25th of February, will be addressed by Professor Robert Wistrich, who, by a strange coincidence, will speak on anti-Semitism and the Jews of France. End of an epoch? Other forthcoming events: on the 10th of March, we will be having a guided tour of the History of Medicine in Jerusalem exhibition at Migdal David, of which details will be posted later. After Pesach in April, our guest speaker from London will be Professor Aubrey Newman. And in May, our speaker, I'm telling you in advance, no date fixed yet, will be our Honorary Secretary, Dr. Kenneth Collins, on Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the Oscar Slater case. If you are not on our mailing list, would like to receive details of future meetings, and I imagine there are quite a few people here who are not on the list, please give your email address to our Secretary, who will make himself known after the event is over. And now I would like to call upon Mr. Simon Calman to propose the vote of thanks.
As the one brother who has remained in London, but who is married to an Israeli, I'd like to thank the Jewish Historical Society Israel branch for agreeing to host this very special evening in memory of our father Raymond Kalman, and to Melanie Phillips for agreeing to deliver this, the inaugural Raymond Kalman Memorial Lecture. My brothers and I cannot think of anyone more suitable than Melanie, a British journalist with an internationally recognised reputation for telling it exactly as it is, without kowtowing to political correctness when the facts are to some rather too close to home, and someone who is so committed to both her Jewishness and Israel. Our father loved coming to Israel from the very first time, when we all came as a family in 1971. He then came with our mother on holiday to visit my two brothers and their families, for Smachot and Pesach, and to speak at the Jewish Historical Society. and his last public speech to the Society was in this very hall almost 2 years ago. He was not uncritical of Israel. In fact, I can't recall him ever being uncritical about anything. But the criticism stemmed from his love of Israel and his love of being a proud Jew. He was something of a maverick and not always the easiest person to get along with. He was highly principled and not afraid to say unpopular things if and when he thought it was the only way of getting it done. From an early age, my brothers and I knew exactly what our father thought on a whole range of subjects, and it was a brave man or woman who ever tried to argue with him. Once described by a senior member of the Anglo-Jewish community as being to the right of Genghis Khan, he hated poverty, the international arms trade, political correctness, assimilation, and hypocrisy of any kind. He took an active part in Jewish politics at the Board of Deputies, and was amongst the first to highlight the very real threat to the community from the left in British politics, when everyone else saw the threat as only coming from the right, and he was frequently criticised in public for this stance. He was also very concerned with the threat to the Jewish community from certain ethnic minorities in Britain, and this even led to him being labelled as a racist. The truth is, our father was nothing of the sort. He was what one might call old school. He believed passionately that everyone, no matter their religion or colour, should integrate, not assimilate, in themselves into British society, play an active part in helping their communities, and that everyone had the right to better themselves. He was an enthusiastic and talented amateur historian and a member of the Council of the Jewish Historical Society for England for many years. My brothers and I were amazed at the number and range of subjects we found amongst the hundreds of books that he amassed over the years. Politics, religion, business, art, literature, philosophy, and military matters. His rather blunt and uncompromising way of speaking and dealing with people hid a very private, caring, compassionate person, someone who was immensely proud of all his children and grandchildren and what they had achieved in his lifetime, especially those who had served in the IDF, and someone who cared passionately about Israel and Jews everywhere. Melanie, our father cared passionately about the issues you've analysed with such eloquence and insight here this evening. He would have enjoyed tonight very much indeed. He would have enjoyed listening to your talk, and he would have enjoyed arguing with you about it afterwards even more. Thank you, Melanie, the chairman, and for all of you for coming here this evening and honouring our father in such an appropriate way.
Thanks for coming. See you next time.